before, it was the Holleran Center on Public Policy and Community Action that reached out to us. And really, thankfully, this is the important part of, I think, being part of the community and having someone like Clayton there, while some of us had kind of some relationships with the Holleran Center. Their increased interest in the housing issue in this community and in New London led us to have a couple of interns last year, any of you at the annual meeting saw Annika and Jordy's presentations that they did from their summer program. And we were really excited when Clayton contacted us and said that there was not only an intern, but a senior who had been doing research at Conn College with Professor Deloge, is that right? On the issue of equity and housing in New London. And so what we have is a situation here where we needed more information, and Maddie already had kind of been steeped in some of that, but Frida and Maddie and I were able to work together to kind of look at what is the information that we don't have that we do need? How do we really look at these barriers? And that Maddie had kind of the skills and the practice to kind of find some of that information that we've not been able to put together. And that's what we'll really see here tonight. I think that it's really important that we look at this, as I said, kind of the academic and the kind of activist, that in doing this, and one of the important things about the community land trust is we're the community, we're preserving land, and we're working in trust with one another, right? And so that is something, a relationship of always mutual respect, and I think that plays in when we're working with interns as well, with staff and with everybody on the committees and the like. So it's been something where hopefully I think Madison has learned a lot, and I think Frida and I have learned a lot within this process, and then we're sharing that here. This information is going to be put up on our website. I'm sure there'll be more discussion about what we hear tonight, starting here afterwards, and really have an opportunity for us to continue to kind of struggle with how do we lower these barriers, how do we knock these barriers down, how do we move forward. I do want to say, because Stephanie's here and because we should say it, that we just got notice from the Community Foundation that we'll be receiving $80,000 towards staffing. So we are very happy. That's a combination of some donors who came to us and said we really want to help, and of us doing the grant. We also have $30,000 from Palmer, $1,000 from Bodenwine, and Clayton and Frida just did an interview with Haymarket. So kind of on our way here to have that. So without further ado, Maddie Taylor is going to do the presentation for us.
Thank you. Hi everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I was so lucky to get to work with Frida and Joanne this year. It's been really exciting. So I'm a senior at Conn, where my senior project and what I worked on last summer and what I've been working on at my time at Conn is specifically looking at housing between 1910 and 1950 in New London, and how aid organizations that really started, kind of the first people to mitigate that were local community-based mutual aid organizations, not unlike the Land Trust. So that's really what I do at school, but while working as an intern, I've gotten to look a little bit more broadly and more contemporarily, which has been really exciting. So today I'm going to talk about kind of a brief timeline of kind of different barriers to homeownership, and we're going to also I've learned about this through reading and chatting with Joanne and Frida, but I'm always open if there's please jump in if I forgot something or you guys feel like there's a good addition or question or anything. Just open for discussion, so please don't hesitate to speak up if there's anything else to talk about. And at the end of the presentation, I have a list of my slides and some other great resources. If anyone else is interested, we can share them around. So in order to think about kind of the timeline of homeownership and the barriers to homeownership, we felt it was really important to think about why homeownership is important and why barriers are being put in place. So I think for myself, it was really helpful to think of home ownership more broadly as something that allows people to invest and gain and accumulate financial stability, and that can be like a big umbrella explanation where all of the other things kind of fall beneath it. All really important because a home kind of like forces people to pay, keeps people from having to pay such a high percentage of their monthly income towards living expenses, and it's like an asset financially because you're investing in that. And as Joanne talked about, that 1/3 threshold, when folks who are in the rental market in a place like New London, where it's really unstable and changing a lot in the last 15 years, it's a major stressor. So that 30% threshold is really not always the case in New London. And when you pay over 30% of your monthly income towards, or your annual income towards housing expenditures, then that's lost payments for childcare, healthcare, food, transportation, and also savings for the future, and savings for potential home ownership in the future. And that being said, kind of the other logistical stressors of renting and in a rental market that's stressful can lead to chronic long-term issues. And there was a wonderful project by the Ledgelight Health District that really talked about that in New London. It was a Zoom panel series that's available on YouTube. That was a really great resource. So something that we thought might be a good thing to kind of get people started thinking and chatting with one another is like how is someone's life different when you're not paying 30% of somebody's income towards housing? Like what is gain and lost with that threshold? All right, so kind of moving forward, but like a contemporary look at kind of population and renter-occupied housing in New London, renter versus homeowners in New London. I just included this because I thought it was really interesting, thinking about home ownership is not consistent or something that's linear, but this kind of shows, you can see the percentage of people moving into New London to live in rental housing doesn't increase or decrease linearly, but it like changes in response to events. It's changing, the amount of people that are moving to New London, but also like what is the landscape that they're moving into when they're arriving in New London. And as Joanne was saying, a significant portion of New Londoners are living in rental housing as opposed to home ownership, which is disproportionate to other cities that are kind of the shape and demographic size of New London. Because obviously in cities more people live in rental housing, but New London is like abnormally high for that. So kind of getting into a timeline of what the rest of this presentation will kind of look like. We're just going to talk about some specific events that have created challenges to home ownership in New London, the beginning and like way early property in New London to the pandemic and the New London we live in today. So kind of an early history of New London. We talked about how it's like really important when we think about New London to think about how New London was built up to be the way it is today. And I think a lot of New London's industries and opportunities and economy on the whole is kind of reliant on its location as a port city. And that really began in the 18th century, and that allowed it to later become, a place of whaling and shipbuilding and a place for boat manufacturing and profiting from places like the Naval Base and the Coast Guard Academy and all those other institutions that set up shop in New London. And that really became the way it was because of New London, its first connection to the slave trade, which I think sometimes forgotten that dark history when we're talking about New London. So between 1749 and 1774, New London County had one of the largest populations of slaves in all of New England, which is really significant given that Massachusetts was the state with the most number of slaves, so that New London County was so concentrated, I feel like is really significant. And there's specific ordinances that were passed in New London, so it was not only those living in slavery or connected directly to the slave trade that were, generations lost from that, but also the folks that were free in New London living. There was an ordinance passed in 1717 that banned New Londoners from, black New Londoners from owning homes or living in New London without special permission from city officials. And that ordinance was retroactive, meaning folks that already lived here, already established businesses or managed to find home ownership were forced to flee. And in one scenario, there's a recorded history of Robert Jacklin, who was a free black man living in New London 2 years after the ordinance passed. And he had had his business there for 2 years and was a long-term resident, but was forced out kind of on the whims of the culture of the time. And so this was really recognized as a barrier to home ownership. Siobhan Haley is a famed abolitionist in New London. I mean, him and lots of folks in that circle recognize this as a barrier in the long term to black people living in New London. So that's why the Hempstead houses were built and sold to free black people living in New London. So in that way, there was a step and an organizing step towards restoring homeownership, but at the same time, it's not enough, and it's still connected to this kind of private interest that is benefiting some private interest while trying to give back to the community in the same way. So really, that's setting the tone for the next 100 years of development in New London. So kind of fast forwarding through history a little bit to the early 20th century, between 1910 and 1940, New London is changing super rapidly. And these are maps that are a little bit not as detailed on the projector. But so the yellow, the light yellow, and the orange represent white New London native renters, and the darker yellow is homeowners. And then in the second map by 1940, you can see there's the other colors represent different migrant groups, both black Southern migrants from the South, rural transplants from other places in Connecticut, and immigrant groups. You can see there's way more diversity in the 1940s, way less homeownership, tighter condensed area. And it's hard to see, but that's Broad Street, Hempstead Street, then Fremont Street up at the top there. So those are much more detailed on the PDF than they are on the screen. But that kind of shows that, homeownership is not linear. You see decreasing homeownership happening between 1910 and 1940, and kind of this class segregation in New London as you see less and less homeownership in the area, increased rental area, and then this same area between 1940 and 1944 becomes a predominantly black area for like the following 10 to 15 years. And this is a time of massive change in New London. You see the industries growing, the naval base is becoming more established, much more industrial jobs for people to move to New London and begin making a living for themselves. But again, homeownership is shifting. So then kind of nationally, after World War II, there's this kind of disparity in who has access to homeownership, because there's this massive growth in homeownership that I think that there's a lot of history, and in the past years it's kind of been a little bit more critiqued, but FHA and home loans and all this slew of federal programs are really making homeownership possible for a lot more people. Before kind of the post-war era and the establishment of the Federal Housing Association, folks would have to buy homes through quick loans that you pay 50 to 70% of the home, and then you have to pay back the loan within a year or two. Then the FHA made it possible for folks to get a mortgage and increasing homeownership in that way. But I think there's a lot of evidence to show that these places were unevenly distributed, specifically with practices like redlining, which barred predominantly neighborhoods of color from receiving these loans, and also predatory lending, which is when private interests would kind of abuse these FHA loans and federal programs to in turn make these loans unpayable for folks to pay back, and then they would benefit while leaving the recipients of the loans worse off than they originally were. So these histories, it's hard to find specific evidence of it in New London, but there's lots of history of it in cities like New York, Chicago, Stamford, Connecticut. These are two great books on it. But really this era of kind of homeownership for some in suburbs, less for people in urban areas, really sets the tone for the disinvestment that leads to the urban renewal in New London in the following decades.
What does disinvestment mean? What do you...
Yeah, so I would say disinvestment in this context, meaning so the government is giving money to people to buy homes in areas outside of the city. So maybe a family can apply for a loan and buy a house in a smaller town further outside of New London. But someone living in New London wouldn't be able to get the same loan to buy a home inside New London. So when there's less people being able to buy homes in New London, there's less investment in a tax base. So less ability to build businesses there, less ability to make schools there and homes and kind of those same community resources.
Roads and sanitation, the garbage doesn't get picked up as regularly, so people want to move out to the suburbs where the garbage gets picked up. So it's sort of urban disinvestment to encourage people who can to leave cities and move to the suburbs.
Leaving the space then for only landlords to be able to buy the houses. So then you're stuck in that rental mess there.
In 1947, when the VA started redlining, the first place that, and black people had owned houses in the Hempstead neighborhood before the Civil War, the first place that they could get a VA loan after the Second World War was the Oakdale section of Montville.
So, I just have a question, I guess. So, when you talked about these FHA loans that were made, and I know that what I'm about to say doesn't have a direct connection to London, but like there were literally billions of dollars that were available to like the returning GIs, and like less than 2% of that went to GIs of color, right? So like there's some intentionality behind that. So like I just didn't want that to get like lost in like this discussion, because like, and you may be headed there, so I apologize if I like stepped on your toes. But I just like, we're talking about the barriers. So like there is a federal program that created this barrier that also like continues to still show up today. So I just wanted to make sure that we don't kind of gloss over that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a really, really great point. I feel like a really good example of that is like the same way like GI Bill money, so money that was given to veterans so that they could go to school when they return home, go to college careers, go into career like prep planning. Those were like locally dispersed, so there was so much room for local administrations to kind of like discriminate in ways that were like there was this like national level discrimination that was horrible and really, really harmful, but there's also this like level of local discrimination as well that was really, really harmful. And that went into the GI Bill as well as like the ways in which like specific towns allocated money to different groups. So that's really important, absolutely.
I'm sorry to get off and field, but I'm thinking of the Recovery Act money that we're getting now and how it's locally distributed, and how like that same thing can go on where the local government can disperse it however they want, and are they dispersing it in an equitable way?
Well, you better call up RE and find out what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And I think that it's really important to have the discussion like you just brought up, because it's that same local administration happens at every moment of crisis in the U.S. So I just highlighted this story of kind of the very beginnings of urban renewal in New London because I thought it was really interesting. So just as the way there's kind of this disinvestment and this narrative of like it's easier to build houses and have a home in a small town or a suburb than it is in an urban area, that kind of narrative gets sewn into how we talk about cities and how city officials are looking at cities. New London kind of becomes like this pinnacle of urban renewal on like a national scale in this moment in U.S. history. The construction of the highway bridge in the 1940s really predates kind of national patterns of urban renewal. So this example of building the highway bridge before like the rest of it was constructed, so predated federal policies, but there's a moment of kind of local politics that I thought was really interesting when the Hodges Neighborhood kind of Businessmen's Association organized and got the city officials to move the construction of the bridge, and it did end up harming other neighborhoods, but this neighborhood was able to organize and ultimately won. And then city officials kind of had the sentiment that after being cut off from the rest of the city through the construction of the highway, they would kind of, quote, like wither away. And it's something to be said that it's a businessmen's association, not necessarily a homeowner or a renters group. But just really interesting that at all of these different points, there's groups organizing and trying to find a way to preserve home ownership and community power. So kind of the beginnings of urban renewal programs in the 1950s. Beginnings of urban renewal nationally kind of start in the 1950s, but specifically in New London, they really begin with the Winthrop Cove project in 1962. And there's so many great resources done by different New London historians and different New London groups. I'm thinking like Anne Vallier and this Connecticut Fair Housing Project have really great resources on this. Yeah, so that's a really drastic example of a whole neighborhood that was kind of taken by urban renewal because it was labeled with this blighted label that kind of allowed for city officials to come in and change it in order to build the highway. And so over 600, nearly 700 homes were taken, and over 600 of them had families in them, and a disproportionate amount, nearly 20%, were homeowners of color, which were disproportionate to the other places in the city. So predominantly black neighborhoods, specifically Shapley Street. There's lots of different accounts of folks living there who felt that their home was taken because of it was taken specifically because of it being a black neighborhood. So kind of there's twofold issues that make this kind of a lasting issue for a barrier to housing in New London. Faulty appraisals. So people weren't paid correctly for the value that they lost. Not only did they lose their communities, but there was nowhere for them to go afterwards. They weren't paid appropriately. Everybody wasn't paid appropriately, but specifically residents of color. And there's lots of different neighborhood descriptions and kind of the appraisal notes at the New London Landmarks Association as well as the Historical Society, where you can literally read that specific neighborhoods were neighborhoods of color, and there was they use the quote misuse and declining rapidly, structure deterioration through misuse and lack of maintenance. So there's like specifically coded language that really shows that they are describing that they're taking this home because it's not being taken care of for some reason. And so there's faulty appraisals, so people aren't given money to buy in New London, but then also there's no more places to buy in New London, even if they did have the money to do so. So here's kind of a list of all the homes that were destroyed, over 600 homes, nearly 700 homes destroyed, and these are the lists of the replacement buildings. So that does not add up to 600. And there's the Winthrop Square, Huntington Towers, and Gordon Court, and as well as the Thames River Apartments, which is the Crystal Ave apartments that no longer exist. And so these are all apartment buildings too, so you're losing home ownership and they're expecting to be replaced with apartments. So that forced a lot of people to just leave New London altogether if they weren't able to use an apartment. So in the 70s and then kind of continuing through the 90s, you have this trend of kind of the end of formal urban renewal, as we saw with the Winthrop Cove, and kind of a lean towards making the cars better for the city because neighborhoods were being built in the suburbs and neighborhoods are being built in small towns. So the city is a place for you to go to work, to do your grocery shopping, to do your shopping, not necessarily where people live. That's like kind of the dominant narrative that's being tossed around at a federal level and kind of seeping into the way real estate actors and banks are looking at the city. So in the 1980s, you kind of have folks kind of averting to Section 8 housing and subsidized housing, which is supposed to be designed so that people can accumulate wealth so that they can later buy a home. And obviously that's not always how it is in practice, as we know all too well. So in the 80s, you have this kind of aversion to subsidized housing being built within your city. That's something we see come up today in contemporary issues as well. But you also have kind of a rise of a luxury apartment. So maybe a young person would live close to their work within the city, while your family would live in a suburb. So that's kind of what's happening in New London at the time. You can see this kind of design from the 90s of New London is kind of like, there's no home, it's kind of a place you park your big car and you walk down the street to go to your job. Maybe you get lunch and then you get back in your car and drive home. So that's kind of the vision for New London and city politics at this time. And then again, you see a kind of a rise of that same urban renewal sentiment in the early 2000s with the demolition of the Fort Trumbull neighborhood. So just, really quickly, this is a very big topic, but in the early 2000s, you have the coming together of the New London Development Corporation, which was kind of a combined group of faculty from Conn College, private interests, city officials, and folks from outside of New London that are really trying to renew the area of New London. So there's this vision that a big company like Pfizer was going to come in and build like New London as a little urban village where there's condominiums and a big Pfizer office building. And so they sought to buy up all properties in Fort Trumbull, but as we know through the Supreme Court case and the wonderful book and movie that's come out about the little pink house, that's not exactly what happened. Is people organized and tried to push them off, arguing that the development of Pfizer offices in that space would not be public use. Ultimately, unfortunately, the 11 homes were taken. It was more than 11 homes that were bought up, but 11 homes were seized as a result of this Supreme Court case not finding in the residents' favor. And then so the Pfizer built their offices there for a few years and left shortly, right before the tax breaks ended in New London. So New London really didn't benefit much from that at all. So homes destroyed, and then after building jobs there for a few years, they took their tax breaks and their 2,000 jobs and left, leaving the area how it looks today. So I learned about this. I'm relatively new to New London, so through reading and books and school, but Joanne and Rana both let me walk around the area and kind of point some things out. But I'd love to hear about if there's folks that were in New London during the time or shortly after, if that moment really felt like a catalyst for organizing in New London, like what the kind of sentiments or the feelings around that was. Obviously, it's a devastating loss, but just the general, was there the feeling of invigoration in places like the Land Trust or organizations at the time?
Any folks who are longtime New London residents who want to share briefly?
I do remember when that happened. Yeah. I do remember a few families that I grew up with who were fighting for their homes not to be taken. And it's very disappointing that that area now is not even being used. Mm-hmm. You took their homes, you forced them out. These were people that was their whole life. They were the ones that worked hard at EB to be over there, to live there, and were forced out to go and have to rent. And they're not doing anything with that area now. God bless their souls, because most of those parents are now gone. But I wondered if they had ever known what happened to be forced out like that, and to see that they're not even doing anything with the space that they took from that whole row of homes that were there. That used to be our stopping point, because we were the kids that walked from Hempstead to Harbor School and had friends along that line. So we knew if it was snow days ongoing, we could always stop at the Pia's house or the Macrinos that stayed over there. And to see it now in current day, and it's not being used, it's such a sad injustice of what happened to them.
Anyone else have a memory or a thought from that time period?
I would just say that there was a lot of organizing around fighting it, and probably the seeds of like the community land trust to go back to that. Mm-hmm. Some of I know like the New London Green Party started around that time, and a lot of it was around this issue. Mm-hmm. And just awareness of how homes can be taken away, and like this presentation, how this has been happening for decades, but it was just like a reminder to everyone of how like these policies can take away people's homes, destroy neighborhoods, push people out of New London, and how that can, and how it's sort of happening again. Mm-hmm. Like knock down the high rise and, you know, give people vouchers and they can't move to New London because there's no place to live in New London. So it's happening. But, you know, that's why people are trying to find these solutions or alternatives.
They just don't want any poor people in the land.
What's that?
They don't just want any poor people in the land.
I think,
Some of them
Danny,
were kind of middle class, and right now they're staying in the hotels in the area for the very voucher.
Yeah.
But they put them out because there's no housing.
Yeah.
right.
So
I think you
Jo-
make a good point, Danny, about organizing, because even though, you know, Maddie's talked about a little bit of organizing here or there, there's not been that kind of mass kind of organizing. Even at the beginning of Fort Trumbull, it took a while for people to really get organizing, and by that point, it was like a slippery slope, right? The first folks who began to sell were usually the landlords. Oh, I'm gonna, you know, and then what happened is that, yeah, these 11 people held out and the like, and I think the organizing, this isn't a community that has a history of organizing until the last 20 years. And some of that is, I think, because people are like, we really got to get together. And certainly when we were organizing the Community Land Trust here in New London, these issues came up. As you remember, as you're in the room, you know, certainly Crystal Ave apartments were a big piece of, hey, wait a minute, they're doing it again. And people remembering this history. There's also a fear that we heard of people saying, but what will stop them from taking our houses through eminent domain? And it's like organizing. You need to make yourself strong enough so that you are not able to just be pushed over. And I think that as we see, particularly these communities of color, oh, move the bridge, what community do we take down? Do urban renewal, what community do we take out? They're all communities, mostly of Black folks, other people of color, immigrants. Fort Trumbull, I knew a lot of low-income immigrants. I mean, that was an immigrant community, right? So it's like, yeah, the people who are the most disempowered.
Ann, did you have something?
It would be great if you had an aerial photo to go with the vacant lot of just how dense that working class neighborhood was. I mean, there were two, the guy who wrote a book on Italian immigration to New London came and did a presentation of the new BP Learner, which got eliminated in the urban renewal of Federal Street, right? But they ended up on Shaw Street, and they invited all the people from the Fort Trumbull diaspora to have seats of honor at that presentation, where he talked about which towns in Italy, which political parties, when Shaw Street was fascist and Fort Trumbull was anarchist, and the drama club was there to do that kind of cultural development, right? So I wish you had, do you know how many houses in total? Because it's a lot more than 11.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
92. I wish Ron and Bob would know, but I think it was 92.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be great to have that photo, because it just is so dramatic.
There's a good video, and I forget, and I can get that to you. There's a video on YouTube that actually goes about around the neighborhood, and it shows the whole Fort Trumbull neighborhood. It gives you just a view of what that neighborhood looked like at the time.
So it's a before and after kind of a video?
I believe it was, yeah.
Cool.
It's been a little bit since I've seen it, and that book was by Richard Lindsay, and he did do that at New London
And
Landmarks.
you could do a great history also of Huntington, right?
Yeah.
Of what happened to different families. I don't know if Larry Lewis is part of that, but Reed Burdick's family. I mean, there are a whole group of people got evicted, right, from homes on Whale Oil Row, essentially. The old Victorian houses.
Oh, yeah. And you're talking neighborhoods, each one of them I grew up in, from Hempstead Street to Shaw Street. I remember learning house from Safe Haven, which we called the Mission. That's where all our recreation took place before we even knew what was happening in the community centers. Even when they took down the high-rise. I remember the high-rise in the 70s where I was a Girl Scout at. So all our recreation took place. And we didn't live there, but we were always open to go over there for different sectors of the community. What is embarrassing and also a disgrace, because we now have where a lot of New London schools are not New London kids, but they're all by New London for whatever resources they want to take back there. But we don't have our very own homegrown that is here.
Yeah, I think that's and like Bob's video. I think it's Bob that made the video. I don't know if it's the same video, but
Potentially, I don't
he
know.
like it's super interesting. He like has a lot of those like personal anecdotes of like families that live on the streets. Really interesting. Yeah, definitely well done.
Back in the 50s, Main
Yeah.
Street used to go.
Main Street used
That's
to go.
right, because that's how
And
we
it
get
used to
home.
be housing over there, which now they're making a different development. I remember because, I remember my grandparents, because there used to be a little park there. And that park is where we played horseshoes before you go all down, and it's now a Walgreens. So it's different seeing New London in its sector that it is now. It's disappointing because when you talk about all of this funding that was available and you should have had a home or you could have had a home, and then we're looking like how when you've already made it to where you pushed out a group this was the Mecca, because my mother, my grandmother, they were that migration that came south. That was here, was my father with the Cape Verdean community that came out of Norwich here. So when you put that to where they all either went back to Norwich and a very few marginal did find homes and stay here, that eventually got forced out of it because what the redevelopment was going to be. So we were initially homeowners there, even if it meant 8 families lived in the same house, so we all could own that house and try to bridge out that way. Or make where the education, or just like you said, go into the military, because that was always what we knew. If you went into the military, your GI Bill would at least be able to come back and buy a home in New London, but you were often given the homes that you knew weren't going to be, or ate more than half of what your GI Bill was going to be to cover the home. So we were renters.
We have homeowners.
So we
Our family, we have homeowners.
And even if it meant, like I said,
That's right.
8 of us being in the same spot till we owned the home and then help the other do the same. So
There's a lot of people in the New London Hispanic community who've operated with the very same strategy. My daughter went to her best friend from the magnet school, lived right across the street. They got their money together. They bought a multifamily house. And it's funny, they didn't have contractors to do hardly anything because they call up family members. And again, the same strategy. You double up the rooms for a little while, but then the house gets bought. There's enough equity in the house. You sell it, and those families split off and then buy their own houses.
So we just have about 5 more minutes of the
strategy
presentation.
today over the past 20 years.
Yeah, and the point of having multi-families and homes in order to eventually buy the home is something that has been a pathway to home ownership first. Like you said, it's very common. But one of the contemporary challenges to home ownership is different contemporary zoning. That it's not exactly in New London, but there's 30 towns in Connecticut that don't allow for multi-family homes to be built and sold anymore. So that is definitely like a very valid and often like very common path to home ownership, but it's being like increasingly attacked in New London. So that's like a great connection to see how it impacted different towns in the 70s up to the 90s, and again today it's an increasing attack. So that's definitely one example of a contemporary challenge to home ownership. And there's again also that same failure to create the replacement housing, like the closing of the Crystal Ave apartments. They were given, like Danny said, a lot of those groups were given Section 8 vouchers, but there's no place for them to use them within New London. So the New London Housing Authority ultimately, I feel like I have the number written down, sorry. Ultimately had to remove those folks from New London, essentially, because there was no place for them to relocate in New London. And then again, the predatory lending kind of continues today, as the FHA doesn't have like the local branch doesn't really have advice to kind of stop at 30% as kind of the max amount you should pay for your home. So for a lot of folks, that can continue to be an issue in accessing home ownership.
I don't understand that last point you just made.
Like the predatory lending
Got it.
kind of practices that occurred in the post-war era kind of can be argued that they're continued today because of kind of the lack of kind of advisors and like help when people are trying to purchase a home. like especially in a housing market like it is today, where people are just selling as fast as they can, and so many people are trying to move to places like outside of New London, that there's like a failure to kind of make sure that people aren't paying a mortgage that's more than 30% of their.
Oh, okay. In other words, basic financial counseling
Yeah.
and taking responsibility for the loans that you make,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah, that's a much better way to explain
Well,
it.
it's to the bank's own advantage, because if they do something stupid and they're allowing the people borrowing the money to put too much down, the house may go under. You have to foreclose on the house, and the bank will never see that money back. So it's like penny wise, pound foolish.
And it's by no means a lot of the time the fault of the person that's buying the house. It's a result of kind of failure of real estate agents and real estate businesses and actors to support people correctly. Because, you know, if those are the only houses available to buy and someone is trying to access home ownership, that's kind of a very common trap. Yeah.
Okay.
So those are kind of the three major issues today that are kind of happening nationally, and you can see play out in New London. And then also like the impact of COVID-19, like our world has changed so much in 2 years, like everything else. So there's like that continued practice of kind of people trying to gain access to home ownership and somehow falling through the cracks. But there's also all these great organizations like Connecticut Fair Housing and Desegregate Connecticut, which is another great program in accessing home ownership. These programs have like set out all these different goals, and they're trying to help people maintain home, rental status and home, paying their mortgages on time, that sort of thing. But it's hard for them to mitigate all these problems because all the issues we see coming out of the pandemic are not just isolated to the pandemic. They're just 100-year-old issues that are. It's really hard for a nonprofit to solve that issue in a year when it's been going on for so long. So that's kind of like definitely an impact of COVID-19 as people kind of grappled with the loss of wages. So I feel like kind of a closing question on the impact of COVID-19, like similarly to the moment of like Fort Trumbull being kind of the catalyst for change in community organizing, did you feel that COVID-19 was a moment where you saw like New London really come together and organize? I know personally for me it definitely was, so.
Maybe we can just sort of hold that question in our minds and weave it into the discussion after the
absolutely.
presentation.
So that was kind of like my contribution to the presentation. So thinking about New London is kind of playing out all the barriers to home ownership just happening in New London kind of all at the same time. And, you know, it's only highlighting little bits and pieces, and there's so much history that's left out of it. But I think it's important to remember, too, at all these different critical junctures, there's organizations that are community-based that are trying to do the best to mitigate these issues. But, yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Maddie.
Thank you, Matt.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm going to turn the lights on. Will you introduce yourself too?
Yes. My name is Anita Pender, and I've been a business owner in New London since 1995. Well, I've been in business for 26 years. And, you know, I recently bought a commercial mixed-use property on Shaw Street that was initially a historic building. She probably knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah, apartment.
Lock and Tees?
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, I had a great uncle when we had the upstairs. There used to be a package store where your business is now. And he used to joke on how they were going to drill a hole in the floor because we had wood floors. And get in the package store. And cover it back up with the rug. So yes, from that end of Shaw Street down to where Pratt Street is now, and before you get to Stewart, the Greens and Johnsons lived. From that part of the 60s up until the 80s, was moved out of it.
Okay.
And that's when Lock and Tees became over there. They changed our apartment into a bar. So I can remember where the bathroom used to sit and how they used to talk about getting those here, so to see it now.
Right.
It's different, the cake lady is now where, that used to be where the Martins used to live, so.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I know that it was a historically black neighborhood, right?
It was Italian before it was ours.
Right. Well, I was told that when I first came there, and there was another young lady that used to have her salon where my salon is, and she's over on Huntington Street now. But someone came in that used to be her client, and she said, "Oh, where's the other lady?" And I said that she's not there anymore because her uncle sold me the building. But she proceeded to say, "Oh, this used to be Italian Row." And I'm like, okay. Well, it's not no more. But what I wanted to say is that I'm finding it hard to inject myself in the community. Even though I've been in the community for 26 years, I'm having a hard time to get in the community. And I'm constantly being left out of the history part of the community. Like when they did the Heritage Trail, there was no reason why my building should not have been included. Especially because of the history of my building. Like, people have come to me and told me that they were married in this building, that they had all types of events in this building that I now own. And it is, as far as I know, I believe that I am the only person of color that owns a commercial historic building in New London. And so I just, female, okay? And so I, like I said, I never get included in anything. And I even joined the Chamber of Commerce when I first got the building, expecting to be able to get like a grand opening, and nobody bothered. I couldn't get the mayor, nobody to come and do a grand opening, but yet they would do, everything is catered to Bank Street or State Street. But when my building was advertised to be sold, it was, "Oh, you'll be a part of the historic part of New London." But, when they come and tear up the street, they take a long time to fix it. But when it was the other persuasion, like there's this place called Star Street, I believe, and that used to be historically black.
Yes, it was.
And then now, it's the most pristine neighborhood in London, and everything is spotless, but then now that my street, there's other building owners, there, the type of care is not there anymore. Unless you say, "Hey, there's a street light out. Hello, come clean this up in front of Walgreens, because I didn't buy it to live in a slum." Because my building, I have to say, not bragging, but my building is one of the best looking buildings in downtown New London. I'm not saying it, but it was a blessing.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that now that I see all of these property managers coming from Long Island and other places, and they're just buying up property, but they're not really taking the time to know people and to know the situations and the history, it's kind of scary.
Yep.
Because, now the other generations will not have the opportunity that I had, like in 2019, in the nick of time. Because when I left my salon, and my salon sign is still over in New London at the Burlington Coat Factory, right there at the bottom. And it's still sitting empty. 3 years later, because he came in and told me that I had to pay $300 more in rent or get out in a month. So, I said, if I'm not going to pay anybody that kind of rent for 23 years and not have anything. If I work for anybody, I'm going to buy my own building, or I will not work at all, because I'm not going to work to pay anybody's mortgage, anybody else's mortgage.
Right, you're gonna work to pay yours.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but like I said, it's like I'm always being left out of these little trails and history, and because it hasn't been easy for me, and the city has come after me financially for no reason, just to make it really hard for me. Like they did an assessment of my building 3 or 4 months after I bought it and had my price set. They came and reassessed it for $30,000 more and forced me to pay it until I could get an assessment reevaluation in February. You know how to do the grand list. So I ended up paying $1,000 more in my mortgage that I shouldn't have been paying.
Right.
And it was always something, you understand what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
it was always just, so we have to do like 200% better than everybody else, and it's just, then when you say that, well, there's something going on here, where they, like they'll assess the property for a lower value when you're buying it. I mean, at a certain price when you're buying it, but then when you want to sell it, then it's assessed for less. So that's how we get less equity. That's how we, have to end up not getting really what we pay for.
Right. So I'm glad you found us. I don't exactly know how we can help, but I think there's a lot of resources in this room, and perhaps you already know lots of people here, but I think I know that John is interested on the CLT board around commercial property and some creative thinking about business ownership and property collective ownership is a model that's worked in other communities that we haven't, as the Community Land Trust in this area, haven't gotten there yet. And that might not be exactly applicable for you if you already, if the building is your business, then that opportunity for cooperative, right, 3 businesses in one building, that kind of thing might not fit where you are. But I think there's a lot that we can collectively learn about really supporting and drilling down on local businesses, New London businesses, supporting local entrepreneurs in a way that in everything that I hear, the city isn't extending themselves to small businesses in the way that they extend themselves to large businesses, large developers, and all of that. So I think there's a fruitful conversation to have here. I want to. So I'm glad that
That's why I
you're
came, because
Yeah.
I wanted to give you guys the inside view of what it's like to own not only a commercial, a private home, but a commercial building. Because
You have apartments upstairs.
I have a house.
A house.
It's used as an apartment.
Right.
I have 1 tenant upstairs.
Yeah.
And then I pay rent to myself as a business owner.
Right.
So so far it's worked out, but what I wanted to do was share with people how shady, I'm sorry to use that word, but it is like,
It's not just this history, it's that
It's
history
right now.
that's right now.
right.
And the patterns are the same.
The patterns
The
are
same
the
patterns that
that
was talking
that
about.
redlining is still happening. And, because when I was buying the building, the real estate agent, she was like, why is it taking them so long to give you the loan? I mean, my credit score was perfect. I had, over a 800 credit score. So that wasn't a problem. They were just always like doing something where they had to question. Even the man that sold the building, he had buildings all along Star Street. He was like, I have never been through this with anybody because I'm in a different ball game now. I'm a commercial. You have to put down 20% of your property. And so I'm in a different field right now. I'm in excuse me to say, but I'm in the white man's world. And he just could not believe how all the hoops that I had to jump through in order to get it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of hoops.
We committed to letting people, releasing people from the program at 7:30. And so I have a couple of notes, and we have this room until 8. And so I hope that you'll find, people to talk to, and that we'll keep talking about, particularly about commercial spaces in town, particularly at this moment when things are so hot in New London around, the big banner headline on the day yesterday, I think, was, kind of the commercial real estate, rents going up for commercial, new commercial development happening all over the town, and the red carpet really being rolled out for those sorts of businesses coming into town. So let me just do this one part. Our goal tonight, right, was to come together again for the first time since the pandemic in person, to learn and remember, kind of put back together our history, whether we were born here and have lived here all of our lives, or whether we're new here, or whether we just kind of use New London, as the mayor said recently, the downtown of southeastern Connecticut, which I thought was, should be on a banner somewhere on some empty storefront on State Street. So to learn together and to not just have it be, and I think we succeeded in that, Maddie giving a presentation, but really having a give and take. And I hope that will continue after the formal program closes, and I hope that will carry into the next event and the next event and the next gathering. And finally, to kind of continue to develop community land trust as alternative and antidote to the history that was presented, and the current reality that we find ourselves in, kind of 2 years into the pandemic, with a lot of cheap money for some people, right? For developers, for big business, credit is still cheap, and there are suitcases of cash kind of around for properties, and yet things for people in New London are, as hard as they've ever been, if not harder. Yep. I just want to share one anecdote. I help out at the food pantry that's organized by Food for the People out of the senior center on, not every Wednesday, but I get there when I can. And I heard, the back of the senior center, of course, is the Martin Center, which the city sold to a private developer for $1 at the last meeting of city council before the pandemic shut everything down. So 120 Broad Street is being turned into market rate over 55 rental properties, right? For kind of the lively seniors to enjoy, right? And so they're doing this, I think, really beautiful renovation, kind of, not really a renovation, right? Like a complete gutting and kind of reorganizing of this space for a lot of money, right? And it's a developer named Tausch He's got, people working there, and his workers, the workers who are working on this beautiful kind of market rate apartment building, luxury-ish, come and get boxes of food from the food pantry. Right, and so that is the economy that we're working in. That people are lucky to have jobs, they feel, and working really hard, and not making enough. That they're not gonna they're gonna say no to a box of free food, right? Along with longtime residents and a lot of elders who come to the food pantry every Wednesday for food. So thinking about how we as community can build alternatives, right? And the model is pretty simple, where Community Land Trust acquires vacant and derelict properties. We don't want to displace anybody. We don't want to move anybody out. There are a fair number of vacant and derelict properties here in New London. We restore them, renovate them, and then we offer them for sale to New London residents of low and moderate income. Right, this is the New London model. Those people are members of the Community Land Trust, and they are ready to become homeowners, which means they kind of go through a process. And for some people, that's a 6-month process. Some people, that's a 2-year process, right? And ideally, we will have homes coming online to kind of at pace with people being prepared and ready. We are starting modestly, right? It's kind of humbling to look at the need, right? And how cost burdened people are, the evictions that people are facing, the foreclosures that people are facing, and many times having fallen prey to predatory lending and extracting more value from their properties than was sustainable over the long term. There are 54 residential foreclosure proceedings happening in the City of New London right now. And the City of New London is the plaintiff in 12 of those. In some of those cases, it's $10,000, $15,000 that is kind of precipitating this calamity, this disruption in people's lives. And then people buy these homes, and they don't just buy a home. They enter into a relationship, or they're already in the relationship, and they kind of make it official, right? As a homeowner within the land trust, people have decision-making power on the board if they want it. They don't have to serve on the board. They have a problem-solving sort of sounding board in the membership of the Community Land Trust. What do I do if my basement is flooding? How do I fix my lawnmower? Can I borrow a nail gun? Right, like these are the sorts of things that have all of us homeowners running to spending our whole weekends at Home Depot, right? Which is like not a fun place to be, right? But you don't just buy the house. You invest into this relationship with others, ideally. And then you have access. We have access to a pool of resources for major repairs, for upgrades that don't have. Again, you sort of like, oh, I could refinance my mortgage and put a new kitchen in, and these kinds of pitfalls that homeowners fall into. And then finally, people build equity and financial stability. Nobody's going to get rich selling a Community Land Trust house. The value is held so that it is affordable to the next person, right? That the community investment is passed on to the next homeowner, but people do remove the equity that they put in, of course, and then there's a math term, a formula for calculating based on the amount of time that somebody has been in the home and a little bit of where the market is, but not as the market goes like this, and land trust goes like this. If that makes sense. So just to kind of share the model. We have local meetings. Our next local meeting is May 12th at 6 p.m. We have been meeting at Victory House, 32 Broad Street, since we regathered in person. If you've signed up on the sign-up sheet and want invitations to those local meetings, maybe just tell me or put a little check next to your name. Two other kind of events to point out. One is that the city has, and perhaps folks know this already, the city has put together an affordable housing plan for the city. It's long. There's a lot of really good ideas in it. The presentation is going to be before City Council. It's kind of one of the pre-meetings. It's 5 p.m. on May 2nd. It's at 6 p.m. on May 2nd. And I think that's an in-person meeting of the Public Welfare Committee. And it's also, you can zoom into it if you want. Going through the plan, I'll leave this here if folks haven't seen it. It's also on the city's website. There's lots of good stuff in it. Expanding first-time home buyers, creating an affordable housing trust, building a registry of landlords, which the city of New London does not currently have. Considering establishing a fair rent commission, establishing a housing counseling office, right? There are lots of really good ideas. But what is not in the plan is how this gets implemented. Who, besides Judy Cox, does this work? I look at this plan and I see a staff of 5, right? People who this is maybe their full-time work. Otherwise, this plan leans very heavily on the work of the Homeless Hospitality Center and the kind of new knowledge base that HHC has developed through the pandemic around walking people, hopefully diverting people from the eviction process. It leans very heavily on all of the other kind of small and under-resourced nonprofits that are out there, and we're not gonna get where we want to go if it's that, right? So coming to that meeting, that's what I'm gonna say is I don't see how this gets implemented without a department, because this won't be Felix Reyes' job, right? So that's coming up. And then finally, the Community Land Trust Board meeting, you guys have put
Annual meeting.
Annual meeting.
What did I say?
Board meeting. It's the annual meeting for everyone.
Excusez-moi, the annual meeting of the Community Land Trust, and there are 4 dates there. So trying to have it at the Hygienic Art Park. Obviously, the weather will be beautiful, and it will be a lovely event. So please put your dates, and Daz and Charms can sort of explain a little bit more about that. I talked all through the Q&A. Terrible. But let's have a couple questions if people aren't just ready to head for the door. So I see Rain. Anybody else? Charms, and then Dan, and then Bud.
I have not a question, but good news to share. So the New London Homeless Hospitality Center has been awarded a contract with CHAFA, which is the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, and we are going to help administrate the My Home CT program, which is a statewide program that has available $30,000 for homeowners who is a foreclosure prevention program.
Nice.
And so it's for mortgage arrears, there's even mortgage moving forward support. taxes, anything that can foreclose, taxes, condo fees, water, sewer, and $30,000, up to $30,000 per applicant, depending on what their need is and their situation. So we are, that program is going live soon, and we got trained up today, and so we will be a location for folks to come. We can help upload all of their mortgage documents and all the required documentation up into the portal, and then CHAPA is going to really manage it and work with the loan servicers and or the towns and municipalities for tax liens and what have you. So there's hope.
Great, thank you, Rain. Thank you. I think, Charmaine, you were next?
Yeah, so this is just a poke for more history on housing in America. PBS has a great special, it's called The Tale of Two Americas, and it talks a lot about redlining, and it describes urban renewal as white flight, which is a more common term for most folks. So if you want more information on the distinguishing between that and our new language that we're classifying some of these housing structures as, that's a great section. It's on PBS, and I think they're airing it. It's usually you have to pay for this program, but I believe they're airing it sometime in May. So look out for that on PBS.
Great. Thank you, John. Dan.
Just one thing, when you were explaining the model of a potential home buyer buying something from the land trust, one of the things that struck me when I learned how this last house was sold is you guys were counseling the buyers. You were looking at their income, explaining how they're not going to get rich quick selling the house, but yet the cost of their mortgage was such that they were going to be able to save a good amount of money every month. And to me, that was part of the presentation we had this evening, is that when you're renting at exorbitant rates, you can't even save to buy a house.
Right. Thank you. Bud and then Brad.
So, real quick, I think that we need to totally redo our tax structure, that we should not be defending. We can never balance the budget in New London with our current property tax system. And previously, we did have land value tax for a short period of time. Also, there is a minority business enterprise coming together. And I had a similar experience with the Chamber of Commerce, so there's a possibility for a junior Chamber of Commerce, which I think would be much more diverse than the present Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you. Brad.
Is the community land trust housing program the same as the ECHO loans?
No, thank you. So there are a number of other affordable housing programs in New London. There's ECHO, which stands for Eastern Connecticut Housing Opportunities. So low and moderate people, I think in New London, but they might cast a broader net, can buy a renovated property through ECHO, and at a kind of on a different scale than, it's not like I think the cheapest house in New London right now is $80,000 on Tinker Court, and it really would probably just need to be torn down, right? So they're kind of pitched to that affordable sweet spot. So ECHO has that program. There's also Home, which is also another sort of a subsidized home ownership opportunity. The difference with the land trust model is that, in an ECHO property or a home property, you can, after a certain number of years of living in it, you can sell it. Habitat is the same way, and you sell it just as a like in the normal way. You sell it at the top of the market or at the bottom of the market. You sell it for what the market can bear. And so
I believe it was like 20 years. We looked at a place that was using the ECHO.
Yeah. So ECHO has, I think, 8-10 properties in New London that it owns now that it's hoping to renovate and planning on renovating, in the process of renovating. It's a really nice one at Ashcraft and Coleman. There'll be a big 2-family right on the corner. So those are, I think people get on waiting lists for those, and so that is another resource in London. Please.
That again, if I'm right with the location, because I believe that was the house that they would give me minimal information for. So I did see where you could see the barge for them to put the trash in out there.
Yeah.
I had asked. Ashcraft Homing going down is right on the corner.
Yeah.
There used to be a little gate there. I
Yeah.
think it was like a 2-family house. Yeah,
It
they
was
would give
blue.
me very minimal information
Yeah.
on how to purchase that home. So interesting.
Huh, oh, that, well, they weren't like, oh, I'm so glad you called,
No.
please let me tell
In
you.
fact, the other house is about half a block from where my father is. I believe that's Wall Street, because there's a garage, auto body, a garage on the corner there. Whereas my father's on High Street, that house right there, very minimal information.
Yeah, it's like walled in, right, they bought up a number of houses on the kind of, those streets between Coleman and Jefferson.
Word at
Huh.
all.
I wanna just try.
Yeah, let's, yeah.
Okay, yep.
Just a plug for folks that are wondering about our process for housing, this little form up here is also a document online. And it is just about how we do our housing selection process for any new home buyers. And we also have he that Homestead Murray did have his card. He was someone that we actually go directly with if you're ready for that process. And there's somebody that is getting ready to be a part of that process.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks. Just a couple things, thank you. One is to remind people we are the Southeastern Connecticut Community Land Trust. So we're actually a regional community land trust, and that New London chapter is our most active at this point, but not our only one. We have folks in Salem who are looking at the problem of it being where there's a lot of white folks there, there's a lot of wealthy folks there, there's not a lot of affordable housing, there's not a lot of opportunities for diversity there, and so they are been organizing and beginning to do a chapter there. We're having some of the same problems there that we are in New London in terms of trying to compete with flippers and others who are going in with cash and buying houses above appraised value. So that's a challenge that we're all having, but just to remind people that we are, because I do know that there are other folks here. And also, just to underline that piece that Frida was talking about, that Maddie was talking about, we're a community land trust. We may not be for everyone, but one of the differences is that we collectively, the members of the land trust, own the land. That's what makes it permanently affordable. So if you're looking at trying to make money off your home, first of all, you're probably not going to do it in a low-income home in any community. I live in Norwich and have owned my home for 40 years, and I don't think it's much more value than it was for all the money I've put into it. But what we do want to do by having a limited equity is maintain these houses for our own communities. That when people go in and then say, I can make a lot of money off my home, what you're saying is, I'm going to sell it to some rich white guy who can flip it and then turn it into a rental. So what we're about is saving these houses for everybody, for the other people in the community, for your own children and grandchildren who can inherit this. So we realize it's a different model. But we also see that it's a 50-year-old model started by black farmers in the South who said, by doing this collectively, we can all be better off. So I think that that's kind of part of the legacy that we're moving forward on and where we want to go with this. So I encourage folks to come to our annual meeting and find different ways to get involved and talk to all the various members here.
Great. Thus concludes our formal presentation. 10 minutes late. We apologize for being a little over. Thank you so much. Thanks to Jess and Church of the City. And we'll be together again. Thank you.